You enter the room already mapping out the exits. Your body sits, but doesn't relax. Your jaw clenches for no reason. Your breath stops before completing its cycle. Nothing has happened. And yet, something is on alert. You respond quickly. You adjust your tone, you control your face before you even feel it. They call this maturity, strength. But the body calls it tension. There's no explosion, no collapse, just this continuous readiness, as if lowering your guard were too dangerous. Eternal readiness is well-trained trauma. Maybe it's not the world that hurts easily. Maybe it's the rigidity with which you try to navigate it. Enjoy it and stay here. If this didn't sound like theory, it sounded like you. You don't realize when it started. There wasn't a specific day. It formed gradually. The body is always ready. The mind is always a few steps ahead. As if something were about to happen, even when everything seemed calm. You enter places already calculating exits. You listen to people already filtering what can or cannot touch you. You respond before feeling, adjust your tone, control your facial expressions, manage the silence. It's not a conscious choice. It's a reflex, an internal muscle that never relaxes, an attention that never sleeps. You call it maturity, self-control, learning from life. But the body disagrees. It accumulates tension where no one sees it. In the clenched jaw while smiling, in the rigid shoulders even when seated, in the chest that doesn't fully expand when breathing. You don't collapse. Not collapsing has become a goal because falling was never allowed. But you also don't rest. There's always a subtle vigilance, and silent expectation that something might hurt, invade, demand too much. And so you anticipate. You close a little beforehand. You feel less beforehand. You trust cautiously. You surrender in moderation. It's not coldness. It's survival. Survival wasn't meant to become a dwelling. But surviving isn't the same as being whole. The problem isn't that you feel too much. It's that you always feel with the brakes on. Every conversation goes through a filter. Every connection undergoes an invisible test. Every gesture carries an emotional calculation. You call this strength. Strength that cannot cease is emotional debt. But strength, when constant, becomes tension. And prolonged tension doesn't protect. It wears you down. The body begins to live as if it were in hostile territory. Even at home, even among familiar people, even on ordinary days. Nothing explodes, nothing breaks completely, but something is always on alert, as if lowering your guard were too dangerous. You learned early on that feeling without control is costly, so you decided to feel less, or to feel quickly, or to feel alone. And without realizing it, you transformed protection into a way of life. The problem is that living defensively doesn't prevent pain. It only changes where it settles. And it doesn't disappear. It waits. There's something you avoid admitting, even to yourself. It's not a lack of sensitivity. It's excessive defense. You don't hurt yourself because you feel too much. You hurt yourself because you try not to feel. The more you harden yourself, the more any touch becomes an impact. The more you protect yourself, the thinner the line becomes between control and rupture. The wound isn't open because someone insists on poking it. She remains sensitive because she never healed inside. You learned not to bleed in public. You learned to swallow your words. You learned not to react in the moment. You learned to come out on top. But none of that closed the wound. It only made it deeper. You don't forget isolated phrases. You don't forget untimely silences. You don't forget the subtle rejections that no one else noticed. You say you don't care, but your body registers. The thought returns. Your stomach tightens hours later. The more you try to seem untouchable, the easier it becomes to hurt you. Because everything that isn't felt becomes a blind spot. Because everything that isn't felt at the right moment becomes raw material for delayed pain. Carl Jung observed that what isn't recognized in consciousness doesn't disappear. It only returns as destiny, not as punishment, but as repetition. The pain you don't go through doesn't disappear. It changes form, it infiltrates. It becomes irritation without a clear cause. Tiredness that doesn't go away. Constant distrust. The feeling that others always have some emotional advantage, and they do. Because whoever accepts feeling suffers once. Whoever tries not to feel suffers in installments. You call this resistance. But continuous resistance becomes structural fragility. The wound doesn't ask for drama, it doesn't ask for exposure, it doesn't ask for loss of control. It asks for recognition. While you insist on not feeling so as not to get hurt, you surrender control precisely to what you're trying to avoid. This is the blade that almost no one wants to face. The more you try not to feel, the easier it is to hurt yourself. Not because you are weak, but because you are fighting against something that cannot be controlled by force. And all the force used against your own feelings exacts interest. At some point, you became the strong one. It wasn't announced, it just happened. It was when they realized you could handle it, that you didn't make a scene, that you solved problems, that you didn't need comforting, and you accepted. You accepted because it seemed better than needing, better than depending, better than exposing yourself. Being strong became your identity. An identity built to avoid pain, unable to feel complete pleasure. A safe place, a silent contract. People began to expect balance, maturity, control, and you delivered. You delivered even when you were tired, even when something hurt, even when you wanted to stop. You learned to be functional under pressure, to keep operating while something inside you demanded a pause. And that was praised. They called it resilience, emotional intelligence, growth. But no one sees the cost of maintaining an image that doesn't admit failure. Because the strong don't complain. The strong don't collapse. The strong don't beg. The strong manage their own pain in silence. The problem is that this role isn't neutral. It demands a price. It demands a price when you realize you no longer know where strength ends and restraint begins. When you can't distinguish self-control from self-annihilation, it demands a price when you feel you can't fall because no one expects it of you. And perhaps you yourself won't allow it. The trap isn't in being strong. It's in not being able to stop being strong. When strength becomes an obligation, it ceases to be a choice. And everything that ceases to be a choice becomes a prison. You are not admired only for your strength. You are kept in it. People become accustomed to your emotional control. They benefit from your stability. And they find it strange when you threaten to leave that place, not out of malice, but because the system has adjusted to your containment. And you feel it. You feel it when you try to be more direct, and the environment reacts. When you set limits and receive silence. When you show tiredness, and someone walks away. The strength that protected you now isolates you. Isolation is the hidden price of emotional efficiency. And the cruelest thing is that no one explicitly asked you to be this way, but the whole context rewarded you for it. So you continue. Not because you want to, but because you no longer know who you are without this role, and the wound, the one that never heals, remains there. Not out of weakness, but because you've become an expert at supporting everything except your own emotional weight. You call it self-control, but the real name is constant restraint. It's not balance, it's vigilance. You control what you feel even before you feel it. Management isn't experience, it's organized restraint. You assess the emotional impact before allowing any reaction. Anticipating has become a habit, predicting has become a necessity, because, at some point, feeling freely became a risk. So you organize everything internally. You classify emotions, you prioritize pain, you decide what can exist and what needs to be swallowed. It's not coldness, it's fear of losing your balance. Control is born as protection, but it remains a prison. You control so as not to depend. You control so as not to expose yourself. You control so as not to give anyone an emotional advantage. And this seems to work. On the outside. On the inside, the cost accumulates. Every contained emotion remains active. It only changes location. It goes to the body, to repetitive thought, for unexplained exhaustion. Control doesn't eliminate the impact, it postpones it. You become predictable to yourself, but unstable inside. There's always a micro-tension accompanying every interaction, a silent calculation. How much of this can I feel without becoming disorganized? You don't live what you feel, you manage it. And managing emotions doesn't transform them. It only keeps them latent. That's why small things hurt so much. A snide comment, a delay, a cold response. Not because they're big, but because they encounter a system already saturated. The defense that should protect has left the wound more exposed. The more you control, the less flexible you become. And rigidity doesn't absorb impact. It cracks. Control creates the illusion of security. But real security requires something you avoid: direct contact with feeling. While you insist on keeping everything under control, you live in containment mode. And continuous containment isn't strength. It's wear and tear. You're not avoiding pain. You're accumulating it. And the accumulation doesn't disappear. It takes its toll. It always takes its toll. In everyday life, this appears in an almost invisible way. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that justifies a clear rupture. They are details. A shorter answer than expected. A silence that lasts a few seconds longer. An invitation that didn't come. A message seen without an immediate reply. You say you understand, that it's nothing, that people have their own issues, but inside, something contracts. You revisit the conversation. You replay the scene. You look for where you might have gone wrong without actually doing it. It's not ordinary insecurity. It's the attempt to maintain emotional control of the environment. You gauge the atmosphere. You adjust your behavior. You anticipate so as not to be surprised. And this is exhausting. Because while you manage your own reaction, others continue to feel without a filter. They make mistakes, retreat, advance, test. And you observe, with the constant feeling that others have an advantage, not because they are stronger, but because they allow themselves to be more whole. When you try to be more direct, the environment feels strange. When you don't soften your stance, someone gets offended. When you set limits, a subtle distancing emerges. It's not punishment, it's adjustment. The system was organized around its containment. When you change the pattern, it reacts, and the reaction comes as discomfort, as silence, as small veiled accusations of coldness, rigidity, or mood swings. You feel like retreating, like returning to the familiar place, like putting on the armor that always worked, because there, at least, you knew what to expect. The problem is that the armor doesn't prevent the impact. It only prevents real contact. You end up living in polished but tense interactions, functional but empty, controlled but unequal. Others feel. You manage. And this difference creates a silent asymmetry. Those who feel freely occupy space. Those who control themselves too much adapt. Not because they are inferior, but because they are always trying not to get hurt. And in this attempt, they surrender their center. They called this maturity, and you believed it. They said you were centered, that you didn't let yourself be carried away, that you thought before you felt. And you assumed this role as a virtue. Being mature became about not reacting. Being balanced became about not showing it. Being strong became about not needing to be strong. But none of these virtues came alone. They came accompanied by inner silence, by emotional self-censorship, by constant self-vigilance. You learn to praise yourself for enduring, for not bothering anyone, for not demanding too much. And little by little, you confuse dignity with restraint. The maturity you were taught doesn't include room for disorganization. It doesn't include experiencing emotions in real time. It includes managing, containing, holding back. This works socially. It works in environments that value predictability. It works for those who live with you without wanting to deal with intensity. But inside, something is lost. Because maturity that doesn't allow for feeling becomes just sophisticated adaptation. And continuous adaptation costs identity. You begin to no longer know what you really feel. You only know what is acceptable to feel, what fits, what doesn't generate noise. Coldness arises as a consequence, not as a choice. Not because you don't feel, but because you've learned to feel in silence. And prolonged silence doesn't organize, it numbs. Virtue becomes a trap when it prevents movement, when it transforms survival into a moral value, when it convinces you that not feeling is a sign of evolution. It isn't. It's just another way to protect yourself, and any protection that requires abandoning inner parts comes at a high price. You gain control, you lose spontaneity, you gain external respect, you lose internal contact, and you begin to live as someone functional but distant from yourself. Praise becomes a prison. Image becomes an obligation. Maturity becomes a place where you can no longer be touched by anything, not by what hurts, not by what matters. There comes a point when the body begins to speak louder, not in words, in signs. A tiredness that doesn't fit with the routine, an irritation that arises without a clear target, a sudden desire to get away from everything. You call it a phase, stress, overwhelmed responsibility, but it's a fracture, not a visible break. A silent fissure between what you feel and what you allow to exist. The body wasn't made to contain indefinitely. It was made to traverse. When you block the passage of emotions, they seek an outlet. And they find one. In the stomach, in shortness of breath, in the insomnia that arrives even on calm days, in the feeling of always being a little behind in relation to your own life. You don't lose control. But you live in tension so as not to lose it. That's the cruel irony. The more you try to remain intact, the more fragile you become inside. Because rigidity doesn't absorb impact. It transfers it. Everything you don't feel at the right time comes back as accumulated weight, as wear and tear, as an exhaustion that can't be resolved with rest. You start to distance yourself from yourself to keep functioning, and you call that responsibility. But responsibility without inner contact becomes sophisticated abandonment. Here's the phrase nobody likes to hear, but which cuts precisely. You're not strong, you're too restrained, and restraint isn't neutrality, it's a forced choice. The price of not feeling isn't the absence of pain, it's a loss of vitality. You keep operating, but something in you is already exhausted from not being able to react, not being able to fall, not being able to be traversed. And when feeling finds no space, it transforms into weight. And weight, sooner or later, demands its due. There's a specific moment when defense ceases to protect and begins to betray. It's not a collapse. It's an internal shift. You realize it's not the world that easily hurts you. It's the rigidity with which you try to navigate it. The armor doesn't fail because it's weak. It fails because it has become who you are. Defenses were made for critical moments, not to become a dwelling place. When you live within them, any contact becomes a threat. This is where something needs to be said without care. Feeling is not the opposite of strength. It's what prevents strength from becoming armor. While you try not to feel so as not to get hurt, you surrender control to fear. And fear doesn't create stability. It only postpones the impact. Carl Jung wrote that what we resist not only persists, but grows, not as punishment, but as a demand of conscience. The turning point isn't learning to protect yourself better. It's recognizing that protection has become identity. You don't need to open up to everyone, nor expose yourself indiscriminately, but you need to stop closing yourself off from yourself. Here, many people decide to leave, because it doesn't offer relief. It offers responsibility. To acknowledge that defense kept you alive, but now keeps you distant. To acknowledge that control gave you structure, but now takes away your presence. If you're still here, it's not because you agree. It's because you recognize something. And perhaps that's why some people choose to follow this type of reading to the end. Not to feel better, but to avoid continuing to deceive themselves. There is no victory in not feeling. There is only postponement. The vulnerability you avoid doesn't bring you down. It dismantles the trap. And what comes after that isn't comfort, it's true. There's a self you built so you wouldn't crumble. It wasn't born false. It was born necessary. It was the self that learned to hold on when no one else did. That organized the internal chaos to keep functioning. That understood early on that feeling too much was costly. This self took you far. It kept you standing. It gave you language, composure, mastery. But it demands payment. Because it was made to weather crises, not to sustain an entire life. The problem isn't having created this self. The problem is not knowing how to escape it anymore. When everything is contained, identity shrinks. You become someone who reacts well but feels little, who solves problems but doesn't get involved, who sustains but doesn't commit. And little by little, you lose your center. Not because you're wrong, but because you're always on the go. The hardened self doesn't collapse, but it also doesn't expand. It avoids external chaos by creating an organized internal chaos. everything in its place, everything under control, nothing in excess. But life doesn't move in compartments. It transcends, it invades, it demands contact. When you live from this rigid self, you begin to confuse stability with absence of movement, peace with neutrality, strength with emotional silence. And something essential is sacrificed, the capacity to be affected without losing yourself. You don't need to become impulsive again, nor abandon the lucidity you've achieved. But you need to face the cost of sustaining an identity built solely to avoid pain. Because this self doesn't fall. But it also doesn't live fully. He holds on. And holding on isn't the same as existing. There's a brutal difference between not falling and being alive. Between not bleeding and circulating. As long as you maintain this rigid identity, you remain functional. But distant from your own center. And perhaps the question is no longer how to protect yourself, but who you've become so you don't need to feel. There's a cost to continuing like this, not immediate, not visible, but constant. The cost of never letting your guard down, of never allowing anything to pass through unfiltered, of maintaining an identity that was built not to hurt, not to fall, not to depend. There comes a point when this ceases to be protection and becomes an existential choice. Not a conscious one, but an active one. You begin to exist through control. And everything that doesn't fit within it is rejected, minimized, or pushed aside. But there is no later for what hasn't been felt. The rite of passage isn't about learning to feel beautifully. It's about accepting that feeling has a price, and that not feeling also has a price. The exchange isn't between pain and comfort. It's between lived pain and managed pain. When you stop fighting against your feelings, you don't become fragile. You become available to yourself. And that changes everything. It changes how you occupy space, how you react to others, how you deal with rejection, silence, boundaries. Nothing can bring you down, not because you've become immune, but because you've stopped defending yourself from everything. The wound heals when it stops being treated as a threat. Perhaps that's why some readings aren't meant to distract, they're meant to cut through. Like what Luciana Santos writes in The Forgotten Agreement, when she touches on that silent pact of surviving at one's own expense. Not as a solution, but as a mirror. It's there, in the pinned comment, for those who recognize this cost and no longer pretend it doesn't exist. Continuing to engage in reflections like these isn't a sign of seeking comfort. It's a sign that something within you no longer accepts functioning on autopilot. And there's no gentle closure here. There's a question that doesn't demand a quick, public, or elegant answer. If your strength was born to not feel, who would you need to stop being to finally live without armor? And when you realize this, what still prevents you from stopping protecting yourself from yourself? And what comes after that isn't comfort. It's true. There's a self you built to avoid crumbling. It wasn't born false. It was born necessary. It was the self that learned to hold on when no one else did. That organized the internal chaos to keep functioning. That understood early on that feeling too much was costly. This self took you far. It kept you standing. It gave you language, composure, self-control. But it demands payment. Because it was made to weather crises, not to sustain an entire life. The problem isn't having created this self. The problem is not knowing how to get out of it anymore. When everything is about containment, identity shrinks. You become someone who reacts well, but feels little. Who solves problems, but doesn't get involved. Who sustains, but doesn't commit. And, little by little, you lose your center. Not because you're wrong, but because you're always on the go. The hardened self doesn't collapse, but it doesn't expand either. It avoids external chaos by creating an organized, internal chaos. Everything in its place. Everything under control. Nothing in excess. But life doesn't move in compartments. It traverses. It invades. It demands contact. When you live from this rigid self, you begin to confuse stability with absence of movement, peace with neutrality, strength with emotional silence. And something essential is sacrificed, the capacity to be affected without losing oneself. You don't need to become impulsive again, nor abandon the lucidity you've achieved. But you need to face the cost of sustaining an identity built solely to avoid pain. Because this self doesn't fall, but it also doesn't live whole. It persists, and persisting isn't existing. There's a stark difference between not falling and being alive, between not bleeding and circulating. As long as you maintain this rigid identity, you remain functional, but distant from your own center. And perhaps the question is no longer how to protect yourself, but who you've become so you don't need to feel. There's a cost to continuing like this. Not immediate, not visible, but constant. The cost of never letting your guard down, of never allowing anything to pass through unfiltered, of maintaining an identity that was built to avoid pain, not fall, not depend. There comes a point when this ceases to be protection and becomes an existential choice, not consciously, but actively. You begin to exist through control, and everything that doesn't fit within it is rejected, minimized, or pushed aside. But there is no later for what hasn't been felt. The rite of passage is not about learning to feel beautiful. It's about accepting that feelings have a price, and that not feeling also exists. The trade-off is not between pain and comfort. It's a matter of both real pain and managed pain. When you stop fighting against your feelings, you don't become fragile. Turn it available for you. And that changes everything. It changes the way you use space. How does he, she react to the other person? How do you deal with rejection, silence, and boundaries? Nothing can bring you down just because you've become immune. But why did he stop defending himself against everything? The wound heals when it is no longer treated as a threat. Perhaps that's why some books aren't meant to be a distraction. They are used for cutting, like what Luciana Santos writes in The Forgotten Agreement when she touches on this silent pact of surviving at one's own expense. Not as a solution, but like a mirror. It's right there, in the pinned comment, for those who recognize this cost and no longer pretend it doesn't exist. Continuing to engage with such reflections is not a sign of seeking comfort. It's a sign that something within you no longer accepts functioning on autopilot. And there's no such thing as a gentle ending here. There's a question that doesn't require a quick, public, or elegant answer. If your strength was born to not feel, who you would need to stop being to finally live without armor. And when you realize that, what's still stopping you from protecting yourself from yourself?